This is Paul Vasquez, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
That's right. We got Paul Vasquez on. We're going to talk about some Army stuff. Paul's an intel guy from way back in the olden days. When you went through, did you go through Huachuca, or did you go through somewhere else?
I never went to Fort Huachuca. I went. My entire advanced schooling was always done through Goodfellow Air Force Base.
Goodfellow. Okay. Yeah. It's evolving still, even though Huachuca became the you say it, or whatever they call it now. They go back to that acronym. They're sending folks out to Utah now. It's always evolving and changing. Did you like your time in Intel?
I did. It was even though it involved 1 year of an unaccompanied tour while I was pretty much right after I was married. It was an interesting experience. I got to probably the most interesting of the times for me was I spent a year with 2nd Infantry Division at the headquarters there, working for the G2 staff, and that was my only time overseas. It was there 93 to 94, but it gave kind of an interesting glimpse into, I was never serving in combat situation, but you were always in a situation where that was kind of ever present in your mind, especially being north of Seoul and whatnot. And so it was a really interesting and a really rewarding time.
People don't understand, especially so far removed now from the Korean conflict. That was an active mission. People from my world, the counterintelligence world, you would go there. You were working. You were in an actual position where you were actually trying to do your job on a day-to-day basis. You were trying to connect, make sources, run those sources. You were handing off sources as you left. It was a real live mission. And so it was a good place to learn the craft, whatever part of the counterintelligence mission you got. And then we're feeding dudes like you, like, hey, here's what we're finding. And then you guys are trying to help us. You're helping the operational side. Like the whole intel machine was actually working there.
Yeah, it was a really interesting time. It was especially interesting because the year I was there was 93 to 94. So that's back when the Clinton administration was first trying to really cajole North Korea back into compliance with the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And then exercises were regularly on again, off again. Jimmy Carter appeared over there in the spring or late spring of 94 to try to lower the tensions on the peninsula. And then just a few months later, Kim Il-sung passed away. And that kind of created a whole lot of questions and angst and, turnover. So it was a really interesting year to be there.
Yeah. Hey, we got Rich Ledet in the house. Dr. Dick, welcome to the show.
Hey, good to be back.
Always fun to have you guys here. Tell us how you met up with Paul, and let's talk about the topic that we're going to cover today.
I met Paul just recently at the Southern Political Science Association's annual conference, and we were placed on a panel together. And I don't remember the name of the panel right offhand, but it was military and security, and maybe operations was in the title somewhere. But then right when I sat down, Paul reminded me that we actually went to the same university and did our doctoral work both at the same place, and we overlapped for a few years. But I don't think we ever got a chance to meet because Paul was off by the time I got to Notre Dame. Paul was already off, like doing professorial things. Is that fairly accurate?
Well, I remember your name, and I think I remember meeting you, but it was only because I was one of the graduate students responsible for helping to recruit incoming students, and I think I had no clue that you had been in the Army, and I think your research interests were more about religion and politics, and so And like you said, I was already fairly well advanced, so I wasn't taking classes. I wasn't quite teaching yet while I was ABD, but I had some office space on campus and was sequestered over there doing research and writing and not taking classes. So we could have interacted a whole lot more before we saw each other in New Orleans, but we were just in different tracks.
Yeah. Well, I was on the American politics track. And that took me in a much different direction. Like Paul said, I mean, I studied religion to finish my dissertation, and that's where most of my coursework was. But actually, it was some of that same coursework that helped me in the work that I did with Pete. You know, not just the ability to understand American institutions and American political culture actually went a long way for helping, not just commanders, but everybody else on the ground kind of understand what the mission was about and what we were supposed to be doing there. So I used a lot of those. A lot of my coursework actually informed the work that I did in Afghanistan when Pete and I met.
This is where I want to jump in, because a lot of what I had done, I had learned from my experience as a spy working on the ground, and I knew what commanders needed to. I understand the commander's mission, but I didn't have the theory, and I didn't have. Rich was fantastic for me because he really opened up the books that I didn't have access to, and what that gave me was the ability to understand, like, wow, there's actual people that have thought about this stuff and worked at it. So when you're talking about trying to build a state and trying to create, and yesterday Andrew Jingaleski and I talked about a lot about Afghanistan and how do you build a state so that it can succeed. If you build rule of law, Rich and I studied rule of law. When the rule of law guys hired probably $200,000+ a year to say, hey, in this state of Afghanistan, in this region where we're at, Zabul, I'm working on rule of law, and Rich and I go out and there's no court cases being heard. You brief, hey, I'm doing a good job, but we can't find it. We don't find the state at all. I'd never thought to do that. So Rich brought that part of it. When the Jordanian colonel comes to join us as the American force en masse, and Rich is like, let's go talk to that guy and get to know that guy, because he's going to understand how religion works here in this Islamic country, because the word Islam is part of the government. I'd never thought about that. So all of these things start to come together. And the reason why I'm making this long-winded explanation is as we're trying to build this state of Afghanistan, I've got a lot of knowledge. I understand how my machine works, and Rich brings all of this theory in. And we're both guys who aren't afraid to go out and patrol, which is really rare in our discipline. And so you have all of these academic people who are afraid to go out and they want to go study goats and a certain subset of people. But here, Rich and I going, hey, this is a combat environment, and the commander's trying to win. We're trying to help the commander win more and lose less. And if we can, make the enemy lose more and win less and build a state, that's hard to do. We didn't do that in Vietnam because these institutions aren't designed to teach people how to do that. Lieutenants don't learn how to do these things. They don't have the license, the professional credentials to go out and say, here is how we build rule of law. Here is how we improve economic growth for farmers. Here is what any of these different governmental institutions, we didn't even engage with the Ministry of Mining. Here's this critical thing, for Afghanistan to deal with. They have all this resources. We don't even engage with these people, or the Ministry of the Interior. We don't have any roads here. Well, that's all right. We'll get to roads down the road. So all these subsets of what has to work to make a state stand up never even occurred to me. And Rich brought all of that to the game. So I wanted to kind of set that foundation, because when we look at Vietnam and we look at Afghanistan and Iraq, we have all these different subsets of what a government needs to be stable. I'm going to shut up and get out of your guys' way.
Well, that's somewhere, where Paul and I's training actually does overlap, because our understanding of the state, I think, and something we've argued even in the work that you and I have done together, Pete, the academic work, it's the ability to improve the functions of government, the state institutions that actually, don't just bring security and safety to a people, but also are able to, contribute to human welfare. You mentioned the Ministry of Mining, pretty important, right? But, don't forget there's some other things the state needs to be doing, and one thing that, like, some work that we did, we were among some of the only people who bothered to reach out to the Ministry of Education, even, for example, to mention another one of those bureaucratic agencies of the state where we could have been using more of our resources to try to not only, help the Afghans govern. Actually, they already know how to govern, but we could have spent more time learning how they were governing in the first place.
Go ahead and go, Paul.
Okay, so yeah, so should I just go ahead and just jump into talking about my research a little bit directly?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So the paper that Richard heard me present in New Orleans, and that I'm going to talk about a little bit, is actually trying to look at dealing with something I've encountered over the years. I've taught for about 16 years, and a lot of those have been classes dealing with national security or international security. And I've had a good number of ROTC students in my classes, ROTC cadets, or students who went on later to military careers. And I've interacted with a fair number of military officers during my time teaching about these kinds of things. And one thing that I'd noticed over the years was that it seemed like a lot of people had kind of a very superficial understanding of some of the problems the U.S. Army had during the war in Vietnam. And so, of course, we're now 50 years removed, more than 50 years removed from the end of the draft. But one of the things I set out to try to do was to try to remind people about some of the things that caused the Army breakdown in Vietnam that were institutional factors specific to the Army and to the U.S. government involving the Selective Service around that time. Because one of the things I've heard in talking to students and some Army officers over the years is the idea that the U.S. military had problems. And I'm not talking here about the way the war went overall, but just, problems with readiness, morale, unit cohesion, and things like that. There's oftentimes this sense that, well, it was because there was a draft in place and people were serving who were required to serve, in some cases against their will. And oftentimes that is what people know about the challenges the Army had in Vietnam. And at some level, I mean, it's kind of understandable because, what most Americans were seeing with regards to the war in Vietnam back when it was going on was, they were seeing, protests around the Democratic Convention in 1968, or they saw protests after the invasion of Cambodia and things like this. And so there might be a tendency by people to just kind of go with what their eyes have seen and think that, well, a lot of people didn't want to serve. Therefore, it was just the fact that there was a draft going on and that was the big problem. But in reality, there are a whole lot more things when you start to kind of peel the onion that you find out institutionally that were kind of issues for the U.S. Army. Okay, and to me, this is important for us to understand because, one never knows what the future holds. I don't think the U.S. government is likely to want to jump back to a draft anytime soon. But, there are issues on the horizon, financial issues with the national debt that may make a draft military a cheaper alternative in the future and something that people want to go towards. People talk from time to time about national service programs that would involve military service as part of that. And just even more broadly than that, I think if there's not an understanding of institutional issues and a remembrance of those kind of institutional challenges from within the service and within the government, potentially they can be repeated or not as much care can be given to those, going into the future.
Rich?
So, Paul, I think that, in theory, a draft is supposed to produce a military that would be representative of the people, right? Like in theory, if we are indeed randomly selecting military age males, over the age of 18, then that should produce a fighting force that looks like the people. And then, so, I guess I'm trying to understand what was the failure then? What was the institutional failure? What was the problem here? Did we lose him?
I'm having to modulate mics. Sorry, because you guys are some feedback. So just bear with me. Go ahead, Paul. Start again.
Yeah. So just before kind of answering Richard's question there, the one thing I would just say is, like, when I talk about the Army having problems in Vietnam, in case anybody out there is wondering, well, if I'm not talking about winning or losing, what am I talking about?
Yeah.
Right. So just in case anybody's, wondering, what am I talking about? I'm talking about things that scholars have observed, like problems with higher than normal rates of illegal drug use in Vietnam. Problems like people going AWOL or deserting, people fragging, people murdering their officers or their NCOs in charge, and also racial strife that was going on within the Army. So those are kinds of the outcomes or effects that I'm kind of thinking about, right? So the question you raised kind of is an interesting one about, like, well, so what were the problems that were keeping the United States from having that representative force in Vietnam? And one thing that's interesting by contrast is, people look back and think positively about World War II from an American perspective. That was a war fought with conscripts and draftees, but what is it? Tom Brokaw, refers to the World War II, guys as the greatest generation. We don't hear that same kind of stuff about the Vietnam Force, right? But to kind of come more directly to your question, I mean, there were a variety of things that were going on that directly and intentionally kept the Vietnam era, quote unquote, draft military from being socially representative. And those things have implications for morale and cohesion and things like that. So first off, one of the things we have is you've got a system where there's a selective service system in place that has set up ways you could avoid going into the military, right? So oftentimes that was pegged towards being a college student, or, and so being enrolled in college, and additionally, maybe pursuing in later years, once they tightened it up, it would have been maybe if you were only in graduate school or only if you were studying in the STEM fields, right? And that was done with a mind, people that were in charge of the selective service, like Louis Hershey, were kind of mindfully experiencing World War I, where some countries had fought devastating wars, like the British, right? You had an entire generation of young men that was really kind of cut down. And there was a concern that if there wasn't some sort of selectivity and kind of channeling going on in the Army, especially in a time when there were many more young people, many more young guys than were needed in the military. So they felt like, we don't need everybody to begin with, and we don't want to bring people in that are going to be rocket scientists and engineers and people that would be needed for, manning the kind of military defense industrial base. So, education, and especially STEM fields or engineering fields, would get you out of the military. So that one of the things that starts to do is decrease the number of people that are college educated that are in the military to begin with. It also contributes to feelings of unfairness as to why these guys are, able to stay back stateside in school while other people are having to go over and fight. On top of that, there were issues about how this was implemented at the local level in terms of draft boards, because scholars who've studied the draft boards have said that these were local efforts to try to implement the selective service criteria, but there was a whole lot of wiggle room that allowed kind of local ties and relationships to kind of influence the likelihood with which somebody would be selected or not. So if somebody's parents knew each other, if you knew somebody who was on the draft board, or your parents knew somebody who was on the draft boards were widely understood as being kind of amenable to all kinds of flexibility there. So even though there was a draft in place, I mean, it was a draft that had like holes in it, like the size of like Swiss cheese, by which, people were able to easily kind of get out of the draft. And people have also said that, it was very easy, and folks from upper middle class or upper class backgrounds could easily understand that you could go to a doctor, you could talk to a doctor, they could find something wrong with you and use that as a grounds for getting you excluded. That's just one factor that's related to kind of some of these problems the Army had, that speaks to some of the problems it had in terms of morale and performance and things like that in Vietnam. One other thing I'll just mention, going even beyond that, or kind of along the same lines of who was serving, was, a large number of Lyndon Johnson was very loath to mobilize the Guard and Reserve to fight the war. The Army had pushed him on multiple occasions to try to do that, but the Guard and Reserve was frequently a place where guys who were in college or had family members that were well connected and maybe from the upper class or upper middle class could go and serve and do their military duty, but do it without ever getting close to Vietnam. So for a variety of those kinds of reasons, the Army that was serving in Vietnam was not a socially representative force. And there's another large component related to that, but I don't want to filibuster here. And if any of y'all have points you want to raise or interject here,
I think.
I mean, you should probably mention the fact that women, if we're going to ignore a large portion of the population.
Yeah. So, but even if
absolutely.
you have a draft done, I'm going to put in air quotes correctly, right? You randomly assign numbers and you randomly select, versus the draft that we actually had, what was actually a truncated sample that we're pulling from, or our sample becomes truncated because we've limited the population to what we have now, which is the all volunteer force, right? But I can see how in each one of these different scenarios, you're still pulling from a society that itself has drug use, problems with, whatever the civilian equivalent of going AWOL is. Quiet quitting, I think maybe they call it these days. Desertion and racial strife, you mentioned too, is one of your variables. So, but you're picking, and the social scientist in me wonders if we're kind of these problems in society that are then manifest in the military because you're drawing from the society. But the social scientist in me wonders, to what extent does each one of these scenarios actually contribute to more or less AWOL or alcohol and drug use or desertion, and that just kind of gets me thinking to, well, based on what you just now said, go take us back to World War II, but don't forget the military in World War II was still segregated, right? So that was segregated, and because we still had racial strife in the broader population, So I'm reflecting right now off of some of the people that Pete and I served with in Afghanistan. Pete, who actually was in the fight in Iraq? Who was in the fight? Right? These all volunteer forces, but you also mentioned the Guard and Reserve forces, which had to do a lot of backfilling in the last two conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I mean, I was a guardsman myself, and the Guard is, I was in the Louisiana National Guard. These are all people with similar last names from down the bayou, you know. So I was in a sister, I was in Delta Company. My brother was in Charlie Company, and that was multiplied over and over again. But see, then when it's time to go to war, like, who are you fighting with? Right. So you got this draft. We got three different scenarios, but it's still drawing from the same population set that itself has some of the same problems that you've identified as some of the institutional issues that was faced by the military in the Vietnam era.
I would add a thing to this. When we look at the current state of recruiting in the military, we're realizing that we've pounded the dog shit out of several zip codes. And then if you just look, like, you do a heat map of where we extract our recruits from, there's a heat map.
Mhm.
and it's really hot in certain areas, right? And so we haven't necessarily escaped this pattern of working in certain socioeconomic areas, which can be good because there's a path out of poverty potentially, but we're also overworking. We're not getting a professional military force necessarily that we think we are, and you don't know this until you slow down long enough to look and go, how do we fix this problem? So let me throw that in there, and I'm going to get out of your guys' way.
Well, let me just jump in if I can, because since you mentioned the words pathway of kind of socioeconomic advancement, because that actually kind of, I think, provides a good segue into another one of the things that contributed, if not to the unrepresentativeness of the force that was fighting or if it wasn't unrepresentative of the force in Vietnam, it made the force that was fighting in Vietnam unrepresentative. And that is, so there was a project in place back, it kind of grown out of efforts that John Kennedy first kind of raised in his administration, which were concerns about the degree to which people being excluded from military service was going to put them behind the 8 ball for civilian careers and life going forward. And there were some commissions that had studied this in the Kennedy administration. And then kind of it comes to full kind of fruition when Lyndon Johnson becomes president. And it was something called Project 100,000. And sometimes it's referred to as New Standards men who were brought in under new standards. And this was something that was initiated under Secretary Robert McNamara and Labor Secretary Wirtz from the Kennedy administration. They were both supporters of it. One name that would later become much more significant was the name Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was a big advocate of this because he was looking at things like breakdown of the urban family, which frequently the African-American family and things like this, and worried about what that would mean for people later in life and for society more broadly. And in his mind, he felt like, and a number of these people felt like military service could be very good and useful for providing people from kind of the lower socioeconomic spectrum writ large, not just the African-American community, but writ large, maybe a better sense of discipline, order, working with people, and things of that nature. So basically what the Army did, and they came to find that I think it was about roughly, well, I can't remember the exact statistic, but there were a large number of people that would be excluded from military service had they simply adhered to their standards. So what they opted to do was to lower the standards, to let in these guys who came in under new standards, with the idea that they would serve and take with them out of the military, these positive attributes. It would make them into better, more productive citizens than they would have been otherwise. Well, that's all like nice, right? It all makes a lot of sense. But then you start thinking about, what are these people qualified to do? What kind of jobs is Uncle Sam going to put these folks in, right? They're not going to be eligible for a lot of the programs that require you to have a high entrance exam, right? And so a lot of these guys had trouble kind of just completing their training without getting recycled. And the long and short of it is, a lot of these guys, because of their scores, were typically sent into combat units in Vietnam, and for a variety of other reasons. Like if you were an Army careerist and didn't want to serve in combat, you could opt to re-enlist and get an option of maybe serving in a different base or maybe getting retrained into a different MOS, or you could volunteer. Like, let's say if you were volunteering to serve, you could volunteer to serve and avoid being drafted, but very few people were volunteering to go serve in Vietnam. They're volunteering for, support, combat service support or combat support jobs, which means that increasingly these guys that were coming in under lower standards were being put, at the tip of the spear. In a war, a limited war, a war of counterinsurgency, a war for hearts and minds, where you've got to use force with a whole lot of discretion because you don't want to create more enemies, than would otherwise be the case. And a lot of these guys that were accepted under the new standards or the Project 100,000, like I said, they tended to be recycled in their training more. They were less likely to be promoted. They were less likely to complete their enlistments. They were much more likely to be court-martialed. I think they were like 2.5 times typically more likely to be court-martialed. And I think part of this Project 100,000 fed into the idea that you've probably heard sometimes with regards to, it was kind of recycled from the American Civil War, where they talked about the war as a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. And the idea wasn't to just bring people in with the sense of using them as cannon fodder. Okay, that wasn't the intention of people in Washington, D.C. They had the noblest of intentions, but once it gets run through the army bureaucracy of what kind of careers do people get assigned to, you end up with a force at the tip of the spear in this environment that's really, up against it in a hostile environment.
And that sounds like a gap between theory and practice.
Oh boy.
That we have seen again and again and again, because the troops that you're talking about, you might be at the tip of the spear, and that sounds good and looks good in the movies. But in this type of warfare and counterinsurgency, that's actually where you need the biggest brains, as it turns out. That's where you need the most culturally competent people. That's where you need, I would go so far as to say, soldiers that have a certain degree of empathy, so soldiers that can pick out from the masses, well, wait a minute, who's actually part of the Taliban here? Wait a minute, they're all Taliban. Okay, well, who's the real Taliban that's gonna come and try to get me tomorrow, versus the people who are just going along to get along, and that takes a different type of soldier, sailor, airman, Marine. And I think Mr. Turner has something to say about that stuff. I can see it on his face.
Well, there's another thing too. If you take someone who has a limited intellect and you say you're going to be in the infantry, and you have limited regard for your own well-being for whatever reason, maybe it's a challenging upbringing, maybe it's any of these things, and a lot of us in the military kind of self-select into that world, and you turns out that you are itching for a fight all the time. Like, there's a lot of things that can happen where you end up being the person that ends up being good at combat for whatever reason, until you're dead. There's a lot of problems with this kind of an approach where you end up being on point because you don't care if you live or die. What am I going back to? And all these different questions. So there's a lot of research questions in this approach to, when you bring people in, and look, they'll be the guy that's like, I was that guy. I was one of those guys, and I went and I became sergeant major of all of the Pacific, right? And you're like, wow, what a miracle, But then you have the 2,000 different court cases that suck up all these resources, and how do you balance all this stuff out? But yeah, it makes my mind spin on the damage that can be done by the one guy that shoots someone's dog because they're too slow to not do that. And you're like, what are you doing? There's like one trigger point in every patrol that can happen that causes this cascading effect. Maybe it doesn't happen today. Maybe it happens the next week, or maybe it's a buildup of stress over time on both sides, where someone just simply doesn't look the other way that day and something bad happens. And all of these things occur. They occur in patrols every day. Every action is being watched. The thing I learned about from being on a lot of patrols is that the other side, that's anybody who's not you, they talk about you, and they know who you are, and they knew who Rich and I were, and so it's like, oh yeah, well, we knew you guys. We were expecting you. We know this about you already. Like, oh, they do talk about you, and it's okay. It's okay that they talk about it. It's good that they talk. In our case, and then one of the things I would try to teach the units that I worked with was smile and wave, be nice. Don't throw rocks at people's dogs, dummy. You know, these kind of things. But until you get into the infantryman's mind, if there's space in there for this stuff, there's problems when you pick 100,000 people and you're like, this person who's just chock full of trauma in a place that's chock full of trauma, and there's not a lot of trust going. Oh,
and as the one person in this conversation who was an infantryman, I think you're right, Pete, about there may not be a lot of space in an infantryman's mind when they're out on patrol, especially in some of those conditions.
Well, one thing I would just kind of add to the Vietnam story to kind of further complicate the story that I've told so far is that, the folks who studied this, there was and I would recommend to people interested in this, the book Crisis in Command by Gabriel and Savage, who were two Army officers in Vietnam who wrote a really scathing retrospective on the war that was published in the 70s. I think it came out in 78. But one of the things they pointed out was that compared to like World War II, the United States had 6% fewer people with at least a college degree in the ranks by the time of the Vietnam War. So there was, that's just not talking about within infantry units or infantry squads or platoons or whatnot, but just within the Army overall, there were fewer people with, a little bit higher intellect, because, a college degree doesn't make you a genius, but frankly, a PhD doesn't make you a genius, right? I mean, I'm not really sure what a genius is, but to the degree you want to have people that can discriminate in terms of using force, there were fewer of those folks around by the time of the Vietnam War. And part of that had to do with some of the channeling policies that were in effect. Another thing too that kind of further kind of erodes the situation is had to do with kind of rotation policy, Army rotation policy. So, and this may be well known to some of your members of your audience, but for those who aren't, like the first thing is that folks rotated over individually instead of as a unit for Vietnam. Okay, so there was no rotation in and out by units. But even beyond that, the standard tour was typically, if you were a draftee and required to serve in Vietnam, you were going to be doing a 12-month tour. If you were an officer, your tour was 6 months. Because the Army saw this as an opportunity for running lots of officers through an active combat, zone, and giving lots of people combat experience. It's a good idea, right? It's a good idea, except when you've got a draftee who's been in country 6 months, who has an officer come in, a new officer come in, a new guy leading his platoon or whatever, who's only been in country a few weeks and has been there much less time than he has. So you've got issues like that. Some other issues that get raised by Gabriel and Savage also is the fact that since the war was less a war with fronts and more a war with kind of base camps from which people would go out periodically compared to previous wars, it was easier sometimes for officers to, one thing that was easier was for troops to kind of go out into the field and then come back and kind of see on a regular basis who was and who wasn't going out, and to see officers that were more inclined to stay at the base camps and kind of direct battle over the radio, or by flying out in a helicopter and then getting back, rather than being out for extended periods of time. And Gabriel and Savage in particular argue that that a variety of these things are counterproductive when you've got the people that are required to serve versus the officers and the leaders who don't have as much time in a location or in country. And especially when you fold that into some of the things we were talking about before with the folks who are being allowed to come in with lower standards and then they're put in the combat units, it creates an additionally kind of, fraught kind of environment.
I got to jump in here. This is too good to pass up. Rich and I wrote a paper, and on purpose, two 6-foot+ hulking white dudes wrote a paper on female engagement in conflict zones because we knew what we were talking about. It drives ladies crazy. And that's the main purpose we wrote this paper. And when we were presenting it, we often didn't get even to the abstract before people were ready to fight with us. And we wrote this thing. And one of the best responses we got was from an African-born American officer who came up and said, you can't, I don't want women in my patrol. When I do this, and he's an American officer, right? And he said, I have to know where the women are in my patrol. They're going to be on patrol. They're in my unit. But, whether he's running a vehicle convoy or a foot patrol, I have to know where they are because I know Islamic men and they crave, that's the word he used, crave American women. And if something happens, I have to provide extra protection to that person, whether it's in a vehicle and they come up and snatch her out. And so as a commander, I now have to look and be prepared to provide extra response for that female in my patrol. And we don't ever consider that responsibility. And we talk about the commander's ethos in our paper because the commander does have these jobs in addition to this other thing layered on top. And it's these theories that people have, and they want to add that on top of what an officer already has to do. And now you have to do it in a 6-month rotation in the case of Vietnam. Nope, that ain't going to work. This is Pete the field guy saying that's not going to happen. You're not even relevant for, I would say, 100 days in modern war. I don't know about Vietnam. That's not my war, but 100 days. And then you're just starting to go, I don't know what the hell I'm doing. So I'm going to let Rich talk.
Well, and to be sure, Pete and I were not arguing for there's no role for women in combat. That was not our point. And in fact, we've both worked with very, very capable women, men, soldiers. You could do the mission. I need you on my team, but it's again, it looked really good in theory and it's a great policy idea to have these female engagement teams. But how does it really, what's the, we like to use the phrase ground truth. Like, what is that? What does it really look like in practice? And this commander's concern wasn't, and again, he has very fine female soldiers that work under him, right? It wasn't whether they could do the job or not, but now we're adding extra layers of complexity onto an already complex mission because we insist that there are these female engagement teams that go out and seek out conversations with women in the Afghan village clusters, and again, great idea, but maybe as a force, we weren't there yet. So we decided to make an ethical argument against doing that very thing, and I think it's, but it's also in part like, what does the force look like? This commander had his own biases and his own set of lenses that he looks at the world through. But the last thing we need is to put that commander in a decision where he's going to make in a position where he might make a decision based upon these other factors that didn't even need to be there in the first place. And then maybe gets more people hurt. We're talking earlier about, you got to, if you got a not very highly intellectually engaged person out there running point and he, pulls the trigger when he doesn't need to pull the trigger, he could get other people hurt too. And we've seen, and these things happen before, so there's just that gap between theory and practice sometimes is just a little bit too big, but how do we, I guess, as a society, because again, I'm looking at policy decisions. That's what Paul's talking about. These are policy decisions that we make. It's not just the Department of Defense that makes these decisions either. It's not just the executive branch. The legislative branch has a role to play in this too. So how do we and I don't even know what's the answer to this, as the guy who's trained in American politics, how do we as a society deal with this issue? because I think it would take a little bit better cooperation and collaboration between the executive and the legislature to actually minimize the probability that some of these issues happens again. This is a really tough policy discussion to have, but it first requires a willingness to accept and appreciate that sometimes your policy is not working or it won't work, because you've got some great examples, Paul, of, hey, this looks really good in theory. Let's take 100,000 dudes and put them in uniform and get them through basic training, and then they're going to improve society. That's a great idea. Now let's go do it. And that's where the breakdown actually in this case, this cost people their lives.
Right. One thing I'll just mention too that I didn't kind of mention before is that's been raised and was raised. And I should mention, by the way, that the insights I'm mentioning here, none of these were originally researched by myself. This paper was largely a synthetic piece trying to bring together the insights of a variety of scholars that have thought about these things. But one of the points that Gabriel and Savage made in their book was that they make the argument that, for example, that, and this might be a source of debate, but they argued that the German army in World War II never suffered the problems at a unit level with regards to breakdown that was seen in Vietnam. But they point out that German officers were killed at a much higher rate in World War II than American officers were during in Vietnam. And for example, they cite the fact that there were I think only 11 officers above the rank of lieutenant colonel that were killed in Vietnam, and that officers comprised 11% of the French army's losses in Indochina versus American officers' losses, which were 2%, constituted 2% of the total losses. And so, one of the points they make is that, to add further into the mix, if you don't have officers that are with units and out there in the field and exposing themselves to mortal risk, that it makes those who are required to serve, it creates all kinds of problems with cohesion, drug use, the sense of unfairness, the sense that if you're dying but your leaders are not nearly exposing themselves to similar kinds of risks, that can have a corrosive effect too. Yeah. Some other factors I'll just kind of mention just additionally were kind of with regards to racial strife. They've cited the fact that, while there were people up above that certainly were trying to push for a more sensitive force, a force that wouldn't be kind of racist and whatnot, that kind of the reality was that there were very few African American officers at the rank of lieutenant colonel or above. And furthermore, the number of African American officers was fairly small, compared to the number of white officers. And then beyond that, those, while there were officers kind of at the leadership level, and Beth Bailey's just written a book a year or two ago called An Army on Fire, talks about racial problems in the Army. And she mentions how there were very, some of the biggest problems were, even though people maybe at the higher levels, like Westmoreland and Abrams, were very kind of concerned about, having a service that's relatively sensitive to racial strife. If you don't have a lot of officers that are African American, it gets more difficult to kind of bridge some of those gaps. And then, to what degree, even if your folks at the top want to have that force that can kind of mediate some of those problems, how well does that get done at the company level, at the platoon level, and at the squad level, right? Because it may not trickle down, and it may not, or it may not trickle down evenly. So
I'll jump in here. I'll say something. Hi, I'm Pete. I'm going to say something. I can't speak for all the military forces, certainly not Space Force, but I would say in general, my experience, says that race is less of a problem at the ground level. This is where the ground truth again kind of comes into play, where the theory that there's racial problems, look, there's always going to be some kind of attention, but I think competence is a bigger problem, and overtasking of people at the ground level is a much bigger problem. You know, we have this ethical saturation problem where we're sending people into a field on a you know, we just overtask. We overtask lieutenants, whatever color they are. We just give them too much stuff to be a master. Hey, you have to manage this election. Okay, great. By the way, economy of force. So don't put yourself too far out because no help's coming. You're no roads. We're not going to come look at you. You're in charge of yourselves. And, you know, it becomes this insane mix of things. By the way, if you see men having sex with boys, we need you to deal with that. We're not going to train you on how to do that, but you're going to have to deal with that as well. Don't get into too many firefights. Make sure you train the Afghan forces, all of them in your region. And just like it's just this impossible stack of stuff. Make sure when you see the Taliban, you go kill them, but don't get in trouble, because if you don't kill them right, we're going to send you to jail. And so it's just all these things that becomes, it's not a possible thing while they rebuild the government that we create and make sure that the populace believes in that guy. So it's just this is a much bigger problem than any of these ethnic and racial problems that we believe are there. We just absolutely overtask these folks. And then we'll say, hey, that's not the Army's problem. That's the State Department's problem. And Rich is going to say, yeah, not a fucking chance. The State Department can, or USAID can ever handle the capacity problem to keep up with all this stuff. So we look at the military because it has the bandwidth to go out to a lot of these regions. By the way, if we can't go to the region, here's what we do. This is for everybody. I'm talking to everybody out there in the world. If you have a map of whatever country X, and we don't like this one scary part of the map, and the Army can't go there, we just wipe it off the map and pretend like it doesn't exist. 100% true. That is what happens. We just don't go there and act like that part of the world doesn't exist. That is absolutely what happens. And so rather than race and ethnicity, let's focus on what we're asking people to do. And then if they don't do that mission, who does? And then if no one's going to do it, then we have to ask ourselves, why are we even there? You know, and so these are real questions that we have to ask, as opposed to spending our time and money, energy working on trying to balance some other equation on something that I think, again, if you show up and you're competent, I think everybody will follow a leader in the military by and large. Will there be some problems? Yeah, but those are small things. Those are command issues. And by and large, those things take care of themselves. I don't know that there's a racial problem from my experience, and maybe Rich will have something else to say, but a lot of this stuff, I think we've stamped a lot of that out. Sexual stuff, different problem.
Yeah, I think my experience is similar to yours, Pete. Like when it's time to go on mission, it doesn't really matter. Like color of your skin matters less. I mean, my personal experience, I did experience some, but it got dealt with boxing gloves back in the company area. And you know, there was a senior NCO in charge. Sometimes it was the senior NCO saying, "You get into the ring now." You know, but those were dealt with in garrison. Once we get to the field, and especially, you know, once we're in harm's way, we're all wearing the same uniform. You know, and but that's also like taking us right back to, I think, what Paul's looking at. Like one of the things we're looking at is like morale and readiness. Like what is actually impacting these things? And it may not be race, you know, it might be some of these other things. And I appreciate you bringing us back to the fact that, Pete, that we do overtask, and we have these expectations of the military to just, you know, be a multi-tool. You know, and now there are some people in the military who are multi-tools. There are multi-tool units, but those units are staffed with people who, you know, understand the mission. You know, they generally wear different color hats or different color patches, you know. But if we're going to be expecting our military to do things like, and again, some of the overlap in Paul and I's work, if we're going to expect our military to go and engage in state building, for example, we could at least be recognizing that there's a different level of training that we could be doing. We could be preparing the force to be engaged in the type of conflict that they're engaging in, you know, because that state building aspect, you know, propping up political institutions, but then making sure that local nationals know how to run, their government according to their own constitution. You got to start somewhere. I mean, we had to start as a country, right? You got to start somewhere. So if you're going to engage in these state building processes and, try to assist the host nation governing officials, be they the formal government, or I will throw in a term we didn't talk much about, or the informal government, to take us back to some of the religious conversation we were having earlier. There's the formal aspect, but then there's what is the informal governing apparatus here, So as soon as we give the force, the Department of Defense needs to figure out a way to get the boots on the ground, need to have the capacity to learn. You can teach people how to learn. You can teach units how to learn. Even learning when to step back. I mean, one of the commanders we worked with, Colonel Stewart, had some really good ideas about how to engage in transition, and how to hand off, some of the capacity to the host nation. But we need to disseminate that knowledge, and we need to train up the force, especially if we're going to have these expectations of what the boots on the ground are actually expected to do.
This is some of that ground truth work that we're trying to do at the Ground Truth Center, groundtruthcenter.org, and correcting some of these conceptions at that theoretic, that diplomatic level, and say, hey, you're focused on race. We're going to tell you a little less energy there, a little more energy on not overtasking lieutenants. And try to, if we're going to put energy into things, let's channel it this way, and this is because we want the system to work. There are great people throughout the system, but there are these vast chasms between realities and what we call it the spaceship. This is what we call the spaceship, Paul. Is like, you got folks up in the Enterprise, and they look down and they're like, hey, let's go down and help these people down there. And they bring a problem with them and a solution kit. And it's like, no, just you got to bring people up to talk to you first and have an understanding of what's going on. And this is one of the things that we get into. And so when you're talking about this, we're all part of this same chart, right? And so I appreciate you taking the time to talk to us and letting Rich and I inject some of our stuff into your conversation, because we do have the lessons of Vietnam that we're still it's a long time later. I am 54 years old, and the Vietnam War was happening when I was born. And so we're still trying to learn these lessons, and we haven't learned a fucking thing about Afghanistan and Iraq. We're still trying to go out and do the same stupid stuff. And we'll be doing it in Ukraine, and we'll be doing Israel when we get a chance to go there. So let me wrap this up with you, give you a chance to chat, respond to all that stuff, and say anything you want to say before we wrap it up. Oh, I gotta turn your mic on. Hang on. Okay, I turned your mic back on. Sorry. Now you can talk.
Yeah, so I would just say, kind of with regards to that, I think a lot of the differences now, is like we're 50 years removed from the end of the draft and 55 years removed from 1968, and I think the fact that race isn't a bigger problem in the service is a function of the degree to which there are officers much more, up and down throughout the force, not only of different races, but also, you've got women and male officers, right? All over the place. I remember working for a variety of officers when I was in who were women, and or NCOs in charge for that matter. But I guess part of the challenge back in 68 and 70 was, that was the year Martin Luther King was assassinated. The Black Power movement was still alive and well. And then on top of that, like to tie this back into the Project 100,000, Project 100,000, most of the men who came in under Project 100,000 were actually men who were white. But a disproportionate number of African Americans came in compared to those who were serving previously. So if you've got an increasing number of these guys who are especially in combat roles in these infantry positions, in these difficult conditions where a lot of the officers are white guys who are in the rear with the gear, a lot of these things start to really kind of overlap, and it's really hard to kind of tease out one and disentangle it, because they're so interlinked. It's some of these issues. But yeah, I appreciate being involved in the conversation.
Yeah. Rich, you want to wrap anything up on your end?
No, I just want to say thanks for talking with us, Paul, and I'm really glad you and I got to meet up. And you've given me, just in this conversation, reminders that I need to go and do a little bit more reading. But I appreciate the Army of Fire, An Army of Fire, the Beth Bailey book. I
Yeah,
got that pulled up right now, so I think that's probably next on my list. Appreciate that.
Yeah. And I appreciate you guys for coming on the show. Let me run these credits and I'll say goodbye to you guys in a second. Hold on. Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by